Right now, there are more than 11 million people locked inside cages across the world. 11 million. That's more than the entire population of Sweden as of the 2025. It is more than the population of New York City. They sit in cells. They wait. Some for days. Some for decades. Some for life. They are in prison. But have you ever wondered, where did all of this begin? Who was the first person to look at another human being and decide, we should build a fortress and put them inside it? For most of human history, prisons as we know them today simply did not exist. Before the 1800s, almost no society used long-term imprisonment as a way of punishment. What they did instead will shock you. People were not locked away to rehabilitate, reflect, or suffer slowly in isolation. They were punished in front of everyone, immediately, publicly, and often brutally. So what changed? Why did civilization shift from public spectacle to private confinement? The answer to this question reaches back to ancient empires, philosophical revolutions, and one of history's greatest reformers whose name most people have never heard. By the end of this video, you will get to know the unlikely group of people who invented the modern prison and why they thought it was an act of mercy. For us to even understand why prisons were invented, we first need to understand the world they replaced. Cast your mind back 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, one of the earliest legal codes in history was carved in stone. The Code of Hammurabi. 282 laws, clear punishments, swift consequences, and none of them involved a prison cell. Steal something? Pay it back. Doubled, tripled, even tenfold. Can't pay? You might be executed. Assault someone? You receive the same wound in return. An eye for an eye, literally. Kill someone? Death, immediately. The ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans had places of confinement, but they were never meant for punishment. They were holding areas. You were locked up while waiting for trial, or while waiting for execution, or while waiting to be sold into slavery. The confinement itself was not the punishment. It was merely a pause before the punishment. The Romans had a famous dungeon beneath the Forum, the Carcer Mamertinus, a dark stone pit where enemies of Rome were thrown while they awaited death. Jugurtha, the Numidian king, starved to death there. The Apostle Paul, according to tradition, was held there before execution. It was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a place of waiting for death. The same logic held across medieval Europe. Justice was not meant to be hidden away. It was meant to be seen. Public flogging, branding, the stocks, the pillory, mutilation, these were not acts of sadism for their own sake. They were, in the logic of the time, efficient, fast, and crucially, visible. Punishment that the entire community could see was punishment that the entire community could learn from. So if this system had existed for thousands of years, if the entire ancient and medieval world functioned without mass imprisonment, what finally broke it apart? The answer begins in an unlikely place. Not in a courtroom, not in a dungeon, but in the mind of a philosopher. The 1700s in Europe were a time of intellectual explosion, the Enlightenment. For the first time, thinkers began to systematically question everything: religion, monarchy, the nature of humanity itself. And among the things they questioned was this: is it actually just to torture a man for stealing a loaf of bread? In 1764, a 25-year-old Italian nobleman named Cesare Beccaria published a small book that would change the world. It was called On Crimes and Punishments, and it was a bombshell. Beccaria made a radical argument. Punishment should not be about revenge or spectacle. It should be about deterrence. The goal was not to make the criminal suffer as much as possible. The goal was to prevent future crime. And for that, he argued, punishment needed to be certain, swift, and proportional, not brutal. He argued that the cruelty of a punishment does not make it more effective, that a certain, moderate punishment deters more crime than a savage, rare one. He was translated into French, English, Russian. Catherine the Great of Russia read it. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy. Voltaire praised it. Beccaria had cracked something open. But ideas, by themselves, don't build buildings. For the prison to actually exist, someone had to design it. And that designer was a man so obsessed with architecture and reform that he spent decades trying to build his masterpiece, and never quite succeeded. His name was Jeremy Bentham, and his invention was called the Panopticon. Imagine a circular building. Every cell faces inward toward a central tower. In that tower, a guard. Or perhaps no guard at all. Because here was Bentham's genius. The prisoners could never know whether they were being watched or not. And so, they had to behave as if they always were. Bentham believed this was humane, efficient, revolutionary. No whips, no chains, no public torture, just the architecture of observation. He called it a mill for grinding rogues honest. Bentham's Panopticon was never fully built, but the idea that you could reshape a human being through controlled confinement, that idea was already alive, and it was about to find its first true believers in the most unlikely of places, a new country, a fresh continent, America. The year is 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A group of Quakers, pacifists, abolitionists, deeply spiritual men and women are meeting to discuss what they see as a crisis of injustice. They are horrified by what passes for justice in colonial America. Public floggings, mutilations, executions for minor offenses. But unlike the philosophers debating in European salons, these Quakers believed they had an answer rooted in their faith. They believed that every human soul was capable of redemption. That if you gave a person silence, solitude, and time to reflect, they would find God. And in finding God, they would find their way back to goodness. Before we continue, here is a little origin moment. Did you know that the word penitentiary comes from the word penitent, meaning one who is sorrowful for their sins and seeking forgiveness? It was literally designed to be a place of spiritual repentance. Back to the origin of prisons. In 1790, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia became the first institution in the world to attempt systematic reform through solitary confinement. And in 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors, a monumental Gothic fortress that would become the most famous and most studied prison in the world. Each prisoner was given their own cell. They ate alone, they slept alone, they worked alone, weaving, cobbling shoes, in absolute silence. When they were moved through the prison, a hood was placed over their head so they could not see or be seen. The only voice allowed in their cell was the voice of the chaplain, reading from the Bible. The Quakers genuinely believed this was mercy. Compared to a public flogging or a hanging, wasn't this humane? Wasn't this, finally, justice with a conscience? Visitors came from across the world to see what America had built. Charles Dickens visited in 1842. He left deeply disturbed. He wrote that the solitary confinement at Eastern State was a torture immeasurably worse than any torture of the body, that the prisoners he spoke to were hollow, vacant, destroyed from the inside by the relentless silence. Dickens had identified something the Quakers had not anticipated, that human beings, placed in isolation long enough, do not find God. They lose themselves instead. The debate over solitary confinement, the tension between isolation as reform and isolation as cruelty, would rage for the next 2 centuries. It still rages today. If you are still watching up to this moment, midway the story, I can tell you it only gets more fascinating from here. If you're learning something today, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more curious minds just like you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who loves history, because the story of prisons is really the story of how civilization itself decides to treat its most vulnerable and its most feared. Let's move on. While Philadelphia's Quakers pursued silence and solitude, New York had a different idea. Auburn Prison, opened in 1821, pioneered what became known as the Auburn system, or the congregate system. Prisoners would sleep alone, but work together in large factory halls in total silence, side by side, never speaking, never making eye contact, only the sound of hammers and looms and the occasional snap of a guard's whip. The Auburn system turned prisoners into a workforce. Their labor produced goods, shoes, furniture, barrels that were sold commercially. The prison paid for itself. This was a pivot of enormous significance. Prison had now crossed a threshold, from a place of spiritual reform into a place of economic production. The prisoner was not just a soul to be saved. The prisoner was a body to be used. By the mid-1800s, Auburn's model was spreading across America. Prisons became factories. Prisons became farms in the South, especially after the Civil War, when a loophole in the 13th Amendment allowed incarcerated people to be used as forced labor. The chain gang, convict leasing. Men rented out to private companies to build railroads, mine coal, pick cotton. The prison had become, for many, an extension of the very slavery it was supposed to replace. This chapter of American prison history is among its darkest, and its consequences ripple forward to this very day. By the late 1800s, a new wave of reformers was challenging the brutal realities of prison life. Zebulon Brockway at the Elmira Reformatory in New York introduced something radical: indeterminate sentencing. Instead of a fixed term, a prisoner could earn early release by demonstrating good behavior, completing education programs, learning a trade. It was the birth of parole, and it rested on a new idea that human beings could change. The 20th century saw an explosion of prison theory. Sociologists, psychologists, criminologists all weighed in. Scandinavian countries began experimenting with open prisons, facilities where inmates could come and go, hold jobs, maintain family life. The Nordic model asked a question that most of the world was not ready to answer. What if the goal is not punishment at all, but simply keeping society safe while making the person ready to re-enter it? Meanwhile, in the United States, a different trajectory was underway. The 1970s brought the collapse of faith in rehabilitation, driven by a controversial 1974 study that concluded bleakly that nothing works. Politicians seized on it. A new era began. Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, mass incarceration. By the 1990s, America was imprisoning people at a rate unlike any democracy in history. Today, the United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. The nation that invented the penitentiary, the institution born from a Quaker dream of mercy and redemption, had built the largest prison system on Earth. Today, the prison is so fundamental to how we think about justice that it is almost impossible to imagine a world without it. And yet, it is a remarkably young idea. Less than 250 years old, younger than the United States, younger than the steam engine, younger than the symphony orchestra. The prison emerged from a specific moment in history, a collision of Enlightenment philosophy, religious faith, economic ambition, and the slow, difficult process of a civilization deciding what it owed to the people it feared and condemned. And the debate that began with Beccaria's pamphlet and Bentham's blueprints and the Quakers of Philadelphia has never truly ended. Should a prison punish, deter, reform, simply contain? Does it do any of these things effectively? And most fundamentally, is locking a person in a cage for years, for decades, for life, is that justice? Or is it simply the most organized, most bureaucratic, most sanitized form of cruelty that civilization has ever devised? Today, more than 11 million people are incarcerated worldwide. The United States has the highest incarceration rate, but recidivism rates in the punitive systems remain alarmingly high, suggesting that after 250 years, the prison is still searching for its purpose. The countries with the lowest reoffending rates, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, are the ones that have moved furthest from the original punitive logic. The countries with the highest rates of reoffending tend to be the ones that still believe that suffering is the point. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say about the prison, 2.5 centuries after its invention, is this: we built it quickly, we filled it rapidly, and we are still not sure what it is for. From the dungeons of Babylon to the Panopticons of Pennsylvania, from the chain gangs of the American South to the open prisons of Scandinavia, the prison is not a timeless institution. It is a human invention, born of a specific moment, shaped by specific people, driven by specific hopes, and haunted by specific failures. And like all human inventions, it can be reimagined, redesigned, perhaps one day replaced. That is the fascinating origin of prisons. Subscribe to the fascinating origin of things, because every object, every institution, every idea has a story that most people have never been told. Until next time, stay curious.